So I first started hearing the slogan "System change, not climate change" in the lead up to the big UN climate summit that happened in Copenhagen at the end of 2009. And then I first saw it in action on the streets, on placards and stickers and banners in the streets of Copenhagen during the summit. And in that context, it was really clear what people were talking about, because inside the conference center where government representatives were meeting, the solutions to the climate change that had all of the momentum were these so-called market-based solutions, which was the idea that you could use capitalism to solve this crisis, that you could really use the same logic of endless profit-seeking in order to create a problem that was created by this idea of putting profits before all else. It was clear, from all of the targets that were being put forward by governments, that even in their rosiest scenarios, if people actually used all of these market mechanisms, we would still be looking at temperature increases that were utterly unsustainable. So this was the response, that actually we cannot deal with climate change without dealing with the underlying causes of climate change. That climate change is a symptom. It's a symptom of a market system gone wild. It's a symptom of a logic that brought us here. Capitalism needs endless growth in order to survive, because if we don't have growth in a single year, or if we contract in any way, that's a crisis. In a capitalist system, that's a crisis. It's a recession. If it goes on for long enough, it's a depression. So we have an economic model that is directly at odds with what our planet is telling us, which is that it is overburdened. And it isn't just overburdened by carbon emissions. It's overburdened by overfishing. It's overburdened by mismanagement and overuse of water. It's overburdened in so many different ways. Our species, biodiversity are all in crisis. But climate is really the meta-crisis. And it brings all of these other issues together. It accelerates all of these other issues. But I see climate change as a message. It's a message that's telling us that this broader system isn't working. If we don't start looking at the core values that got us into this crisis, the values of domination, the values of this idea that we can escape the consequences of our own action just by expanding to a new frontier, the logic that we are such an incredibly clever species that we can think our way out of any mess, that we are somehow unbound by the laws of physics and chemistry, that we can fix anything. We hear these ideas all the time, and they're modern manifestations of old ideas of manifest destiny, of the ideas of Francis Bacon, that the role of man was to mold nature as if it were a work of art, and so on. If we leave these values unchallenged, the values that brought us here, then in a time of crisis, those values won't disappear. They will actually become more exaggerated. And this is something that I've studied for a long time, looking at what I call disaster capitalism, how moments of crisis actually can become opportunities for hard right political and economic ideas to fill the vacuum that often is created in a crisis where people are confused and desperate and looking for strong leadership. As the climate crisis deepens, we will start to see what my friend and colleague Christian Parenti calls the politics of the armed lifeboat, where countries with more resources that are less vulnerable to the early stages of climate change because they have stronger public infrastructure will fortress themselves. And even though the crisis was created in the wealthy countries through our industrialization, there will be a cruel irony in the way we will respond, where the people who did least to create the crisis will feel the effects first and worst. And as they migrate to try to find safe haven, to try to find a home when their homes disappear because islands are disappearing, or because land becomes so arid that it's inhospitable, we will have built these fortresses to protect ourselves. And this is not, some science fiction. This is just looking at what we are doing already and following it to its logical conclusions. If you don't tackle those underlying values, those underlying ideologies that are often unspoken, then they will simply become more pronounced and exaggerated in those moments of crisis. If we don't start really listening to what the planet is telling us and what we're experiencing with all of our senses, with extreme weather, then that's the future that we will go towards. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just paying attention. That's just looking at what we do now and looking at how we will do it even more so in a time of crisis. So we're going towards that militarized, fortressed, geoengineered future. We don't have to. We can change course. And that's what the concept of climate justice offers us, and why it is so important. Because, you know, the more I learn about climate change and what the real solutions to climate change are, the more I realize that actually the solutions to climate change are many of the ideas, policies, models that progressive movements have been fighting for now for decades, in many cases hundreds of years. Agroecological farming methods that store much more carbon in the soil than industrial farming methods, which deplete it. Localizing our economies, because we have the most fossil fuel intensive an insane economic model. This thing that they call free trade is just madness in the context of climate change. And that doesn't mean that you don't trade. Yes, you trade, but you don't trade absolutely everything, which is what we do now. You don't act as if distance doesn't matter. And that was what the whole free trade era was based on, this idea that we could completely erase distance. And now the bill is coming due. And that bill is coming due in the form of climate change. So there are lots of ways in which responding to climate change help us address multiple problems at once, like the fact that our communities have been weakened by this economic model, that we have lost jobs, that we have lost a sense of community. So as we localize our economies, what you have an example of how you actually deal with two crises that are in fact the same crisis, which is our economic crisis and our ecological crisis at the same time. So yes, you need to relocalize your economies, which flies in the face of the whole free trade / globalization agenda that we've been living for the past 30, 35 years. But even more than that, I mean, climate change demands that we regulate corporations. It demands that we regulate our economies. You know, the right doesn't like that very much, but if you accept that allowing corporations to do what they've been doing, which is treat the atmosphere as their open sewer, if you accept that that is imperiling life on the planet, then the role of government is to intervene, and intervene strongly in putting caps on those emissions, penalizing producers very aggressively. It also requires that you do this at every level, locally, state, provincial, nationally, and internationally. And this ties in with another one of the right-wing conspiracies about climate change. They say it's a conspiracy to bring in world government. Well, it's not a conspiracy to bring in world government, but you absolutely have to have a strong United Nations architecture with real enforcement in order to respond to climate change, because this is a crisis that absolutely transcends borders, where actions in one country affect people on the other side of the planet. And so there has to be a trans-border response to this. Planning became a dirty word during the Cold War. That's what communists did, right? But if you want to respond to climate change, you need to plan, and you need to do it at every level. You know, whether you are a group of climate justice activists in Oakland working with your city council to come up with a climate change action plan that will ensure that it won't lead to gentrification, and that the people who are living in Oakland will still be able to afford to live in Oakland because there's affordable housing next to the public transit. That requires long-term planning. But I think even more fundamental than that, climate change requires that we fundamentally question the logic of economic growth. And that you can see why that is such a frightening idea. So I think in so many ways, we are in denial about the true implications of climate change. A lot of the big green groups are so embedded in being part of this system. They've partnered with big corporations. They jet set around the world and go to Davos and are just part of that elite consensus. And it's impossible for them to start talking about capitalism because they're so much a part of that elite circle now. So it's really up to grassroots activists who are dealing with the injustices of capitalism in their communities already, and to link that to climate change. I think sometimes people talk about this as if like we have to get the big green groups to understand that it's about the system. I think that might be a lost cause. I think the real challenge is to get all of the wonderful grassroots activists who already understand that there's a fundamental problem with our economic system because they're dealing with it because of housing, they're dealing with it because of austerity cuts in their communities, they're dealing with it because of union busting in Wisconsin, or postal workers in Canada, and make sure that climate change is part of that movement, is really a central part of that movement, that people understand that this is not just sort of an environmental issue that we can just leave to the environmentalists, but this is an issue that has to be part of this broader movement, in a really fundamental way, because nothing exposes the failures of our economic system more than climate change. And it isn't some sort of little add-on that you can add to a laundry list of other issues. It's bigger than that, because this is the issue that has the power to wipe every other victory off the map.